The morning started the way most peaceful mornings do in our neighborhood: quiet, ordinary, and deceptively calm. The sun was just climbing over the rooftops, casting that soft golden light that makes everything look better than it usually is. I stepped outside with my coffee, glanced at the front of my house, and saw the American flag gently moving in the breeze. It had been there for months, properly mounted, clean, respectful. Nothing flashy. Nothing political. Just a flag. It was something my father taught me growing up: if you're going to fly it, you do it right. I never imagined that piece of fabric would turn into a problem. That illusion shattered when I noticed a bright white envelope tucked halfway under my front door. No stamp. No return address. Just the HOA logo printed in bold at the top. My stomach sank before I even opened it. Inside was a neatly typed violation notice, cold and official, citing me for unauthorized exterior display and non-compliant flag mounting. The fine was $250, payable within 48 hours. Failure to comply would result in escalating penalties. I read it twice, then a third time, hoping I was misunderstanding something. The flag. The same flag I'd seen on half a dozen houses in this neighborhood. I stepped back outside, looked at it again, and felt the confusion turn into irritation. I didn't have to wait long for clarification. About an hour later, a familiar SUV pulled into my driveway like it owned the place. Out stepped the HOA president, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, posture stiff and rehearsed. Karen. She walked straight toward me without so much as a greeting, already flipping through papers like a prosecutor preparing a case. She pointed at the flag before I could say a word. "That needs to come down," she said flatly. I asked her why. She sighed dramatically, as if I were wasting her time, and told me the HOA had received a complaint. According to her, the flag violated community aesthetics and had not been approved by the architectural committee. I tried to stay calm. I explained that the flag was mounted according to federal guidelines, that it wasn't damaged, oversized, or disrespectful in any way. I even mentioned that other homes had flags up too. She barely listened. Instead, she tapped her clipboard and reminded me that rules are rules, and that the HOA had final authority over exterior displays. When I asked where exactly this rule was written, she smirked and said I was welcome to attend the next HOA meeting after I paid the fine. Her tone wasn't firm. It was smug, like she was enjoying the moment. As she turned to leave, she paused and added one last thing over her shoulder. "You have 48 hours to remove it. After that, the fine doubles." Then she walked back to her SUV and drove off, leaving me standing there staring at the flag. I didn't take it down. Instead, I noticed movement across the street. My neighbor, an older man I'd waved to plenty of times but never really spoken with, was standing on his porch, eyes fixed on the flag, and then on me. A moment later, he stepped off his porch and started walking my way. That's when I realized this wasn't just an HOA issue anymore. The HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening, and by the time I walked into the community center, the mood already felt hostile. Folding chairs were arranged in rigid rows, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they were just as irritated as everyone else in the room. Karen sat at the front table with the rest of the board, perfectly centered, perfectly composed, flipping through her binder as if she were preparing for battle. The American flag was still flying at my house, and I could tell by the tightness in her jaw when she saw me that she knew it too. A few neighbors glanced back at me, whispering quietly. Word had spread fast. When my name was called, Karen didn't waste time. She read the violation aloud in an exaggerated, authoritative voice, emphasizing every word like she was speaking to a courtroom. Unauthorized exterior display. Failure to comply. Continued defiance. She announced that the fine had already doubled to $500 due to my refusal to remove the flag. I stood up and asked how flying the national flag could be considered defiance. She replied that the HOA had the right to regulate anything visible from the street, regardless of what the object was. "This is a private community," she said sharply. "If you don't like it, you're free to move." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I tried to explain that federal law protected the right to display the American flag, especially when done respectfully. Karen cut me off mid-sentence. She claimed that HOA bylaws superseded outside opinions and accused me of making the situation political. That word, political, hung in the air like a bad smell. I wasn't making a statement. I wasn't protesting anything. I was just flying a flag. But Karen leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and declared the matter settled. If the flag wasn't removed by morning, legal action would begin. Liens, collections, court filings. She listed them calmly, like a grocery list. That's when I noticed the man sitting in the back row. The same neighbor I'd seen watching from his porch earlier that day. He hadn't said a word all evening. He just listened, arms folded, eyes locked on the board. As Karen wrapped up her speech, he slowly stood. The room went quiet, not because he demanded attention, but because something about the way he moved commanded it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply asked one question, clear and steady. Can you show me the bylaw that allows you to fine someone for the American flag? Karen blinked, clearly caught off guard. She laughed lightly, brushing it off like an interruption. Sir, this doesn't concern you, she said. He didn't sit down. Instead, he took a step forward and repeated the question. This time, his voice carried weight. Karen's smile tightened. She fumbled through her binder, flipping pages faster than necessary, stalling. The rest of the board avoided eye contact. For the first time that night, Karen wasn't in control of the room. The man finally introduced himself. He said his name, then added one detail that changed everything. He was a retired veteran. 20 years of service. He'd lived in the neighborhood longer than most of the board members combined. He looked directly at Karen and told her he'd like to continue this conversation, on the record. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and absolute. And in that moment, I realized Karen had just picked the wrong fight. The veteran didn't rush his words. He stood there in the middle of the community room, hands loosely clasped in front of him, posture straight without being stiff. There was no anger in his voice, just certainty. He repeated his question one last time, slower now, giving Karen every chance to answer it properly. Show me the bylaw that says the American flag is prohibited. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Karen cleared her throat and tried to regain control, insisting that the HOA had broad authority over exterior appearances. She used phrases like community standards and board discretion, but never once cited a specific rule. That's when the veteran reached into a worn leather folder he'd brought with him. He placed it gently on the table and opened it with deliberate care. Inside were neatly organized documents, highlighted pages, printed statutes, and a copy of the HOA bylaws themselves. He explained that years ago, when the neighborhood was first established, he had been part of the original advisory committee. He didn't brag about it. He simply stated it as fact. According to him, the bylaws had been written to comply with federal law, including the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. The language was clear. The HOA could regulate how a flag was displayed, but not whether it could be displayed at all. Karen tried to interrupt, but he didn't let her. He read the clause aloud, word for word, his finger tracing the line on the page so everyone could follow along. Then he produced a second document, the federal statute itself. He explained calmly that any HOA rule attempting to outright ban or fine a homeowner for displaying the national flag was unenforceable. Not debatable. Not subjective. Unenforceable. The room shifted. Board members leaned forward. A few neighbors whispered to each other. Karen's confidence drained by the second, replaced by irritation and something closer to panic. Still, Karen laughed. It was sharp and defensive. She accused him of misinterpreting the law and claimed that legal enforcement was beyond the scope of a neighborhood meeting. The veteran nodded, almost sympathetically. He said that was fine. He explained that he'd already spoken with a friend from the local Veterans Advocacy Office earlier that day. He mentioned the words formal complaint, civil penalties, and public record. Each phrase landed heavier than the last. Karen's pen stopped moving. One of the board members quietly asked for a copy of the documents. The veteran slid the folder across the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply stated that if the fine wasn't withdrawn immediately, the issue would be escalated outside the HOA. He reminded the board that ignorance of the law wouldn't protect them from liability. Karen opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since this started, She had nothing to say. The authority she'd been leaning on all evening collapsed under the weight of facts. As the meeting adjourned abruptly, neighbors began standing and whispering openly now. Karen gathered her papers with stiff, jerky movements, refusing to look at anyone. The veteran caught my eye on his way out and gave a small nod. Not a smile. Not a victory gesture. Just acknowledgement. But as we walked out into the night, he leaned in slightly and said one quiet sentence that sent a chill through me. "This isn't over yet." The silence after that meeting didn't last long. By the next morning, emails started flooding inboxes across the neighborhood. Not just from Karen, but from other board members too, short, carefully worded messages calling for an emergency session to review enforcement procedures. The tone was different now. Defensive. Cautious. When I walked outside and saw my flag still flying, untouched, I felt something shift. The power Karen had wielded so confidently just days earlier was suddenly unstable, like a chair with one leg cracked. Everyone could sense it. The emergency meeting was nothing like the last one. Karen sat at the same table, but she wasn't centered anymore. One board member had moved to the middle seat, subtly but deliberately. The veteran was there again, sitting quietly in the front row this time. Karen tried to open the meeting with her usual authority, but she was interrupted almost immediately. Another board member raised concerns about liability and asked whether fines had been issued without proper legal review. Someone else mentioned selective enforcement, how flags had been ignored on some homes but targeted on others. Each comment chipped away at Karen's control. She snapped back defensively, but every response sounded more strained than the last. Then the documents came out. Not just the ones the veteran had provided, but internal HOA emails, printed, highlighted, time-stamped. Messages from Karen pushing for zero-tolerance enforcement. Complaints she'd personally followed up on, even when the architectural committee had advised restraint. One email suggested escalating fines specifically to make an example. The room went still as a board member read portions aloud. Karen protested, claiming she was only doing her job. But the words were there in black and white, and they told a different story. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. When the discussion turned to legal exposure, Karen finally lost her composure. She accused the board of undermining her, of siding with outside pressure, and of disrespecting her authority. Her voice rose, sharp and brittle. The veteran didn't say a word, but his presence alone seemed to steady the room. One board member calmly explained that the fine issued against me would be suspended immediately, pending legal review. Another proposed a temporary halt on all flag-related enforcement. Karen stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back, and declared the meeting was being derailed. No one stopped her when she stormed out. After she left, the mood shifted again, lighter but tense. The board voted to formally withdraw my fine. They agreed to revise the HOA policy to explicitly comply with federal law and to issue a community-wide notice clarifying homeowners' rights regarding flags. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. But it was decisive. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me quietly, some apologizing for staying silent earlier, others thanking me for standing my ground. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I stood in my driveway and looked at the flag waving calmly above my porch. Across the street, the veteran raised a hand in a small, respectful salute before turning back toward his house. The neighborhood felt different now, less controlled, more awake. But even as things seemed to settle, one thought lingered. Karen hadn't said her last word. And consequences, I was learning, don't always arrive quietly. The official notice arrived 3 days later, sealed in a plain envelope and delivered by hand. This time, there was no fine inside. No threats. Just a formal statement from the HOA board withdrawing all enforcement actions related to my flag and confirming that the previous violation had been issued in error. The language was careful, almost apologetic without ever using the word sorry. It also included a second document, an updated policy draft acknowledging homeowners' rights to display the American flag in accordance with federal law. Karen's name was nowhere on it. That absence spoke louder than any explanation could have. Word spread quickly. Within a week, more flags began appearing up and down the street. Some were small and modest, others larger and freshly mounted, but every one of them was flown correctly, respectfully. It felt less like a protest and more like a quiet show of solidarity. Neighbors who had never spoken before started nodding to each other in the mornings. A few stopped me to say they hadn't realized the HOA had gone that far until now. One older couple thanked me outright, saying they'd taken their flag down years ago after a warning and regretted it ever since. Karen resurfaced once, briefly. She sent a sharply worded email announcing her resignation, effective immediately, citing personal reasons and a lack of board support. The message was cold, defensive, and carefully written, but it couldn't hide the reality underneath. Her authority had evaporated the moment she tried to enforce something she didn't understand. There was no farewell meeting. No acknowledgement from the board beyond a short confirmation notice. For someone who had once controlled the neighborhood with a clipboard and a smirk, the exit was remarkably quiet. The veteran and I spoke one evening as we stood outside watching the flags move in the breeze. He told me he didn't step in because he wanted a confrontation. He did it because he'd seen this kind of thing before. Small abuses of power that grow when no one challenges them. He said the flag wasn't just fabric to him. It represented the rights people forget they have until someone tries to take them away. Then he thanked me for not backing down, even when it would have been easier to just comply. That night, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the neighborhood felt calmer than it had in years. The flag outside my home caught the last light of the day, steady and unbothered, just as it always had been. No fines. No warnings. No threats. It wasn't a loud victory or a dramatic ending, but it was a real one. And sometimes, the quiet wins are the ones that last the longest.